Etymology. Name of Australia. The name Australia, pronounced slash, stra, lee, slash in Australian English, is derived from the Latin terra australis, southern land, a name used for a hypothetical continent in the southern hemisphere since ancient times. When Europeans first began visiting and mapping Australia in the 17th century, the name Terra Australis was naturally applied to the new territories. Until the early 19th century, Australia was best known as New Holland, a name first applied by the Dutch explorer Abel Tasman in 1644 as Nieuw Holland and subsequently anglicized. Terra Australis still saw occasional usage, such as in scientific texts. The name Australia was popularized by the explorer Matthew Flinders, who said it was more agreeable to the ear and an assimilation to the names of the other great portions of the earth. Several famous early cartographers also made use of the word Australia on maps. Gerardus Mercator used the phrase Climata Australia on his double cuneiform map of the world of 1538, as did Gemma Frisius, who was Mercator's teacher and collaborator, on his own cuneiform wall map in 1540. Australia appears in a book on astronomy by Sir Jacob Jacob Zembarth, published in Frankfurt am Main in 1545. The first time that Australia appears to have been officially used was in April 1817, when Governor Lachlan Macquarie acknowledged the receipt of Flinders' charts of Australia from Lord Bathurst. In December 1817, Macquarie recommended to the Colonial Office that it be formally adopted. In 1824, the Admiralty agreed that the continent should be known officially by that name. The first official, published use of the new name came with a publication in 1830 of the Australia Directory by the Hydrographic Office. Colloquial names for Australia include ounces and the land down under, usually shortened to just down under. Other epithets include the Great Southern Land, the Lucky Country, the Sunburnt Country, and the Wide Brown Land. The latter two both derive from Dorothea Mackellar's 1908 poem, My Country. History of Australia. Timeline of Australian history. Indigenous peoples. Prehistory of Australia and Indigenous Australians. Aboriginal rock art in the Kimberley region of Western Australia. Human habitation of the Australian continent is known to have begun about 65,000 years ago, with a migration of people by land bridges and short sea crossings from what is now Southeast Asia. The Majid Bead rock shelter in Arnhem Land is recognized as the oldest site showing the presence of humans. In Australia, the oldest human remains found are the Lake Mungo remains, which have been dated to around 41,000 years ago. These people were the ancestors of modern Indigenous Australians. Aboriginal Australian culture is one of the oldest continual cultures on Earth. At the time of first European contact, most Indigenous Australians were complex hunter-gatherers. Recent archaeological finds suggest that a population of 750,000 could have been sustained. Indigenous Australians have an oral culture with spiritual values, based on reverence for the land and a belief in the dreamtime. The Torres Strait Islanders, ethnically Melanesian, obtained their livelihood from seasonal horticulture and the resources of their reefs and seas. The northern coasts and waters of Australia were visited sporadically for trade by Mukassan fishermen from what is now Indonesia. European exploration and colonization. European maritime exploration of Australia. European land exploration of Australia and history of Australia. 1788-1850. Landing of Lieutenant James Cook at Botany Bay. 29 April 1770 landing of James Cook at Botany Bay. On 29 April 1770 to claim Australia's eastern half for Great Britain, the first recorded European sighting of the Australian mainland, and the first recorded European landfall on the Australian continent, are attributed to the Dutch. The first ship and crew to chart the Australian coast and meet with Aboriginal people was the Dyfken, captained by Dutch navigator Willem Janszoon. He sighted the coast of Cape York Peninsula in early 1606 and made landfall on 26 February 1606 at the Pennefather River near the modern town of Weipa on Cape York. Later that year, Spanish explorer Luis Vaz de Torres sailed through and navigated the Torres Strait Islands. The Dutch charted the whole of the western and northern coastlines and named the island continent New Holland during the 17th century, and although no attempt at settlement was made, a number of shipwrecks left men either stranded or, as in the case of the Batavia in 1629, marooned for mutiny and murder, thus becoming the first Europeans to permanently inhabit the continent. In 1770, Captain James Cook sailed along and mapped the east coast, which he named New South Wales, and claimed for Great Britain. Following the loss of its American colonies in 1783, the British government sent a fleet of ships, the First Fleet, under the command of Captain Arthur Phillip, to establish a new penal colony in New South Wales. A camp was set up and the Union flag raised at Sydney Cove, Port Jackson, on 26 January 1788, a date which later became Australia's National Day. Most early convicts were transported for petty crimes and assigned as labourers or servants to free settlers, non-convict immigrants. While the majority of convicts settled into colonial society once emancipated, convict rebellions and uprisings were also staged, but invariably suppressed under martial law. The 1808 Rum Rebellion, the only successful armed takeover of government in Australia, instigated a 2-year period of military rule. The following decade, social and economic reforms, initiated by Governor Lachlan Macquarie, saw New South Wales transition from a penal colony to a civil society. The Indigenous population declined for 150 years following settlement, mainly due to infectious disease. Thousands more died as a result of frontier conflict with settlers. Colonial Expansion, History of Australia, 1788-1850, and History of Australia, 1851-1900. A calm body of water is in the foreground. The shoreline is about 200 meters away. To the left, close to the shore, are 3 tall young trees. Behind them on an incline are ruins, including walls and watchtowers of light colored stone and brick, what appear to be the foundations of walls and grassed areas. To the right lie the outer walls of a large rectangular 4-story building, dotted with regularly spaced windows. Forested land rises gently to a peak several kilometers back from the shore. Tasmania's Port Arthur Penal Settlement is one of 11 UNESCO World Heritage listed Australian convict sites. The British continued to push into other areas of the continent in the early 19th century, initially along the coast. In 1803, a settlement was established in Van Diemen's Land, present-day Tasmania, and in 1813, Gregory Blaxland, William Lawson and William Wentworth crossed the Blue Mountains west of Sydney, opening the interior to European settlement. The British claim extended to the whole Australian continent in 1827 when Major Edmund Lockyer established a settlement on King George Sound, modern-day Albany. The Swan River Colony, present-day Perth, was established in 1829, evolving into the largest Australian colony by area, Western Australia. In accordance with population growth, separate colonies were carved from New South Wales, Tasmania in 1825, South Australia in 1836, New Zealand in 1841, Victoria in 1851, and Queensland in 1859. South Australia was founded as a free province. It was never a penal colony. Western Australia was also founded free, but later accepted transported convicts, the last of which arrived in 1868, decades after transportation had ceased to the other colonies. In 1823, a legislative council nominated by the Governor of New South Wales was established, together with a new Supreme Court, thus limiting the powers of colonial governors. Between 1855 and 1890, the 6 colonies individually gained responsible government, thus becoming elective democracies managing most of their own affairs, while remaining part of the British Empire. The Colonial Office in London retained control of some matters, notably foreign affairs and defense. In the mid-19th century, explorers such as Burke and Wills went further inland to determine its agricultural potential and answer scientific questions. A series of gold rushes, beginning in the early 1850s, led to an influx of new migrants from China, North America and continental Europe, as well as outbreaks of bushranging and civil unrest, the latter peaked in 1854 when Ballarat miners launched the Eureka Rebellion against gold license fees. From 1886, Australian colonial governments began introducing policies resulting in the removal of many Aboriginal children from their families and communities, referred to as the Stolen Generations.